Welcome, everybody. Many of you will know Andrew Graystone. John Smyth and the Cult of Iwerne Camps is published on Thursday. Andrew's the person who took the story to Channel 4 News in 2017, and he's continued to pursue it since then, finding and listening to survivors where they've been willing to share their stories and asking questions of those who believed could and should have acted to stop the abuse. John Smyth was an eminent barrister. He used a network of Christian camps, the Iwerne Camps, to groom public schoolboys for sadistic beatings. Most of these in the UK took place in a garden shed in Winchester during the late 70s and early 80s. Boys were left bruised and unable to walk. Smyth told them that they were bleeding for Jesus. The Iwerne network has been hugely influential in the Church of England. The alumni of the camps have served its largest and richest churches and have gone on to high office, indeed to the highest office. Most members of that network will have known nothing of what was going on, but by the end of 1982, at least 25 people, apart from the victims, did know. They put their own personal and organisational interests above those of the victims, and Smythe was able to go on to abuse 90 boys in Zimbabwe. One boy, Guy Nyachuru, died at one of Smythe's camps in circumstances that have never been fully explained. Smythe was still grooming boys in South Africa when he died in August 2018. Before opening the floor to your questions, I'm going to ask Andrew to spend a few minutes laying out some of the facts of the story for any of those of you who may not be familiar with them. Then during that and after, please use the chat box and let me know that you want to ask questions. And if you can include the broad area of your questioning, then I might be able to group them with others who want to ask similar questions. So we'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes just with Andrew laying out the story, and then we have plenty of time for questions after that. So Andrew, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for the labour of love of 6 years in writing this book. Tell me who John Smyth was.
John Smyth was a barrister living in Winchester in the 1970s and the early 80s. He was notable as the go-to barrister for Mary Whitehouse, and so he led for her on the prosecution, for instance, of gay news, and on a couple of other notorious trials, the trial of the director of Romans in Britain at the National Theatre, and an attempt at taking a Channel 4 programme called Scum off the air. He was also prominent in the conservative evangelical wing of the church, and he became associated with the Iwerne Camps, was very quickly made chair of the Iwerne trust that organised those camps.
You should perhaps just say a word about where the Iwerne Camps came from and what their ethos was.
Yeah, Iwerne Camps was a movement. They still exist in a sense, that started in the 1940s, early 90s, actually slightly before that, started by a clergyman called Nash, who was universally and without irony known as Bash. So they're known by many people as Bash camps. The philosophy of the Iwerne Camps was and is that they would select the brightest and best boys, as they saw them, from a very select group of independent schools, what they saw as the top 20 top 20 independent schools, and those young people were invited onto an intensive discipleship course in a very narrow form of Christianity that revolved around the camps. There were 3 camps in the summer, and also camps at Easter and New Year, but there was also a through the year mentoring program, which I would see as cult-like. Those camps, it ran until 2 years ago. They were taken over, the movement, the Iwerne Trust movement, was taken over in 1997 by another organisation, the Titus Trust, but there was a almost complete handover, both in terms of personnel and culture and assets, from the Iwerne Trust to the Titus Trust. The reason that took place ostensibly is because the Iwerne Camps, although they were run by the Iwerne Trust, were ostensibly owned by the Scripture Union. And through the 1990s, there was an increasing distance between the Scripture Union, which was quite an inclusive and rather theologically broader movement, and the Iwerne movement, which was narrow and exclusive. So the two-party company in 1997 and the Titus Trust took over. A key part of the story is that the Titus Trust has always wanted to dissociate itself legally and in terms of any kind of moral or financial commitment from the Iwerne Trust.
Now, John Smythe was a trustee of Scripture Union at one time. He was then running the Iwerne Camps, but obviously he was off the scene insofar as he was in Africa once the Titus Trust was established. And the relationship of those three organisations to one another, it has perhaps been a bit blurred and leads perhaps to some of the questions around accountability that come up in this story later on. Is there you mentioned the sort of slight some sort of theological difference between Scripture Union and between Iwerne and Titus? Can you characterize very briefly the sort of kind of Christianity that the Iwerne Camps espoused?
Yeah, it was a very narrow view of Scripture. Nash, for instance, was a fundamentalist and a biblical literalist, and even to this day, the Iwerne people would be on that wing of the church. It was a closed kind of evangelicalism that was close to the Brethren movement, really. And the way that it expressed itself in the camps was both militaristic. Camps were run by commandants and adjutants and quartermasters and so on. I explore in the book some of the roots of this in the experience of the Second World War. So militaristic in that way. Only boys until quite late in the day, men only, and men only from exclusive independent schools. And also a factor that I think has been largely unexplored, almost exclusively white to this day. There's a strong kind of racial exclusivism in running through that culture.
And theologically, in terms of understanding Jesus and what he effected on the cross and things like that, I mean, how was that manipulated by Smythe to serve his purposes?
Yeah, there was a strong central doctrine of substitutionary atonement, meaning that Jesus died for you and for you alone in order to deal with your sins. And the response to that is a total commitment to Jesus. If Jesus did this for you, there should be nothing that you wouldn't do or give for Jesus. And the way to do that, the way to give to Jesus, was through this particular set of beliefs and practices as set out by the Iwerne movement. And
Smythe presented himself as a kind of loving, disciplinary father who helped boys come atone for their naughtiness, basically.
Yeah, and notably, he. I mean, Smythe's relationship with his own father is quite interesting. His father was an alpha male explorer, surgeon, mountain climber, distant, remote kind of figure. Smythe recognised that a lot of young men at independent schools have, at best, a distant and at worst, a really quite poor relationship with their fathers. And he said, I can fill this gap for you. So many of his early victims were people who had poor relationships with their families. And there's something also about choosing boarding school boys who are often already traumatized by distance from their fathers and saying, well, I can fill some of that gap. He did that quite explicitly with them and chose Bible verses that illustrated that in order to groom people, he would say, I am your father on earth. God is your father in heaven, but God can't discipline you, so I will discipline you instead.
And how did he get access to the public schools?
Breezed in, really. First of all, at Winchester College, he lived nearby. He used to go and visit. Winchester's a very open college, physically quite open, in the bits of it are spread around the city. And he used to go and call in midweek, take people out to play squash. Used to go to, there was a Christian forum on the Sunday morning at Winchester. Smythe used to go along, was invited to go and speak very often. And then after Christian forum meetings on a Sunday morning, he would load up his car and take a bunch of boys home with him, feed them up with lunch, play with them in the garden, and then increasingly, as the years went by, take them to his garden shed to beat them in the name of Jesus.
So in 1982, you identify, the first real opportunity that Christian leaders had to face up to and put a stop to what he was doing. Can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, early in 1982, February in 1982, one of the young men who had been beaten by Smythe began questioning whether this was legitimate kind of Christian doctrine or not. This was a guy who was by then at Cambridge University, went to his vicar at Cambridge, a man called Mark Ruston, and said, "Is this okay? What's going on here?" Mark Ruston was horrified. On his own initiative, wrote a report for the Iwerne Trust, having interviewed 16 of the young men who had been beaten, and told the trustees of the Iwerne Trust, who he wrote to, that this was not okay, that it had to be stopped, that it was illegal. He knew that it was illegal and should be stopped. The people who received that what became known as the Ruston Report, and in particular David Fletcher, who was at that time the leader of the Iwerne movement, moved very quickly to isolate the information and make sure that it didn't get out any further. I guess because he thought that it would be damaging to the work, as they called it, capital T, capital W. So that report was suppressed, and the information about it was suppressed. Quite how that happened, I could explain in a lot more detail, but
the information also got to Winchester School, didn't it, and the head teacher there. So
yes,
it wasn't just within the Iwerne network that information was shared.
No, that's right. I mean, there had been some conversation about the appropriateness of Smythe's coming and going at Winchester before then, but by the end of by October 1982, the head of Winchester College, a man called John Thorne, had been told by parents of some of the boys what was going on, and they got together, and a couple of parents, along with John Thorne, visited Smythe, and he signed he gave an undertaking not to meet with young men again. Notably, he didn't sign it. You'll see in the book there's the undertaking that he gave is reproduced, but it's handwritten and unsigned. And he'd agreed to seek psychiatric help, not to meet with young men again, and not to visit Winchester again. He didn't visit Winchester again, but the rest of it, he seems to have laughed off.
But clearly, the opportunities for him to continue in the UK were coming to an end, and he was enabled to go to Zimbabwe. I mean, can you explain how that came about, and who it was that helped him to go to Zimbabwe, and under what pretext?
Yeah, I mean, Smythe spent the early 80s toughing it out in the UK, continued to work for Mary Whitehouse, continued to run big evangelistic projects and to deny the rumours that were increasingly spreading about him. So some members of the Iwerne Trust decided that it was imperative that he leave the country, and the men in grey suits, as it were, went round and saw him and told him that he had to go. And so an arrangement was made with a missionary organisation called African Enterprise, that he should get a job in Zimbabwe, which he did. So in 1985, moved to Zimbabwe to work with African Enterprise, taking with him a young man that he'd met at Theological College in the UK. And within 18 months, he had started a new camping network there and was beginning to have inappropriate relationships with, by this stage, not just young men, but younger children, boys, who he was beating on and around the camps.
And with less theological justification.
Yeah, the theological justification kind of went out the window by the time he went to Zimbabwe. It was then all about fun, as he saw it, discipline. He beat them there with either with table tennis bats or with a rather larger sort of bat called a jokeri, which he used there. And he was quite open with their parents about what he was doing. And one of the bizarre things is that he sent a letter to parents saying this is what he was going to do, that he was going to beat their children. And it didn't seem to make a difference. Whilst he was in Zimbabwe, a number of children began to complain about the way he was treating them, and parents too, and also pastors in Bulawayo, which is the second city of Zimbabwe, began to get together and complain about him. Their complaints coalesced around a lawyer called David Coulthard, who eventually wrote a report in 1993, bringing together all the allegations that had been made about John Smythe. They did refer back to the Iwerne Trust in the UK to say, is this true? Is this the case? And had some reports confirming what had been happening in the UK. That report, the David Coulthard report that was published in 1993, went to head teachers in Zimbabwe and in South Africa, and to Christian leaders, to at least one bishop. Was quite widely known. It resulted in Smythe's arrest and charge. He was charged with 5 specimen counts of crimen injuria, which is the Zimbabwean equivalent of GBH. And he was also charged with 1 count of culpable homicide in relation to Guy Nyachuru, who was the young boy who died in his care on a camp. That trial,
Just tell us what happened, or what you know of what happened with Guy's death.
Yeah, Guy was a 14-year-old young man from just to the west of Harare, who was sent on a camp as a Christmas present by his family. And on the first morning of the camp, his body was found in the school swimming pool. It remains unclear how he died. A narrative was constructed saying that he must have either not been a good swimmer or knocked his head or something like that, and that remains possible. For me, it's equally possible that he died as a result of some kind of misdemeanor that went wrong, and that his body was placed in the swimming pool. I guess we won't ever know that. Smythe went to his family that same day and gave them $1,200, which he said $200 was a refund of his camp fee, and the $1,000 was what Smythe called comfort money for the family. We'll never know precisely how Guy died, but we have our suspicions.
The prosecution against Smythe in Zimbabwe collapsed. What happened there?
It's complicated, but essentially it collapsed because Smythe was very clever. He basically attacked the system. He attacked the prosecutor, and he also pulled in a lot of political influence, up to and including Robert Mugabe. And it was when Robert Mugabe intervened that the trial eventually came to an end without any kind of conclusion. Smythe continued there for another couple of years, and then left Zimbabwe in a hurry and relocated first to Durban and then to Cape Town.
The third time when you identify real opportunities to stop Smythe, who continued to groom boys in South Africa, was in 2013. And this is when one of the survivors, called Graham, contacted someone from the Iwerne network to make a complaint against Smythe. That was passed on eventually to the Diocese of Ely and eventually to Lambeth. Can you talk about that? What happened and where the opportunities to stop the abuse arose for the church then?
Yeah, it was actually in March 2012 that Graham, as we call him, first contacted a member of the Iwerne network, actually by chance, well, not by chance, but he contacted the member of the Iwerne network who had been the first to disclose the abuse to Mark Ruston all those 30 years earlier. That member of the Iwerne network, in a very Iwerne way, had worked his way up through the ranks until he was then the incumbent of what had been Mark Ruston's church. So bizarrely, the two disclosures were made to the same vicarage 30 years apart. So Graham in March 2012 wrote to that clergyman asking for help. No help was forthcoming for him. You might remember that 2012 was a time when the Jimmy Savile events were emerging. And towards the end of 2012, Anne Atkins wrote a couple of articles in the Daily Mail saying that she had been aware of a significant case of abuse by a lawyer in a church context. And she was asking herself, why had I not done more about this? That article prompted a member of the public who had had some association with the camps to write to the Titus Trust saying, this surely isn't still going on, is it? So Titus Trust were notified again in November of 2012 that something was up. It wasn't until the following year, that's 13 months after Graham had approached the church, that that vicar notified his diocese of what was going on. It was referred to Ely Diocese. And then about 5 or 6 months after that, Ely Diocese informed Lambeth Palace in August 2013. And that would have been the first time in the modern era that Archbishop Justin Welby was made aware of it. One of the quirks of this story is that in the early 1980s, when the hierarchy of the Iwerne Trust was trying to warn people off John Smythe, word about that had actually reached Justin Welby, who was told in 1982 in a very sort of gentlemanly Iwerne Trust sort of way, well, Smythe's a bad chap, he's no longer one of us, he's to be avoided, a kind of veiled warning. And it's interesting that one would have thought that when Justin Welby was eventually told explicitly in August 2013, he might have remembered what he'd been told 30 years before, and he might have thought, gosh, that must be what it was all about back then. In fact, though, nothing was done then by Lambeth Palace, and one of the core criticisms is that inaction at that stage allowed John Smythe to carry on abusing in South Africa for a further 5 years.
Right. Okay. So this was when Justin Welby he wasn't in the church at that time. He was working in the oil industry in Paris, but attending an Anglican church there. That's correct, isn't it?
That's right.
I'm sure people want to come back and unpack many things of what you have said, Andrew. Please start to put your questions in the chat box, or alert me to the fact that you want to ask questions. Just before I open the floor, can you just briefly tell us about how you came to be involved in this story?
Sure. I was approached, I've had a background working in media and communications, and occasionally working for voluntary sector organisations or the odd church or whatever, helping them with their comms. And I was approached by the Titus Trust in 2014, who said that they had they were concerned that an incident of historic abuse might be made public. This is Graham's complaint to them. And they wanted some advice as to what to do about it. I went away and looked at it, realised it was much bigger than they had either realised or were telling me, one or the other. And so I went back to the Titus Trust and said, look, there are three things you need to do. You need to get somebody in from the outside to investigate this from top to bottom, so that you know exactly what is going on. And then you need to report what you discover to the police or the social services. And then you need to check that your contemporary safeguarding policies are completely up to scratch. And then once you've done those things, I could perhaps help you with how to communicate it. And I was given a very strong message saying, well, we're certainly not going to do that. Off you trot. It's only later I discovered I was the second comms advisor who had come in and given them exactly the same advice and been dismissed. So I was then sent away, but unfortunately they'd sent me away with a dossier of information. And so I was left thinking, well, what am I supposed to do with this? I can't really put it on the shelf and walk away. So in due course, I started working with Kathy Newman at Channel 4 News towards bringing that information out, which we did at the beginning of 2017. So that's how I was involved. In the subsequent years, I've been kind of contacted by and walking alongside many of Smythe's victims, and also others who've been involved in the network, and subsequently other people who found themselves abused in church contexts as well.
Okay, well, it's certainly time for other people to come in with their questions, or indeed comments, if anybody just wants to sort of comment on anything that they've heard. Andrew Brown, I'm going to come to you first.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, it's a remarkable and rather dispiriting book. One of the things that is interesting to me is the psychology of the victims. What sort of boys did Smythe pick on? Did he pick on the losers, or did he go for winners?
I think it's a mistake to think that cult leaders pick on losers. Many of the people who were victims of Smythe were extremely bright. Certainly they were highly privileged, but some of them were very smart as well, or they were sporty. I mean, the major common factor is they were all good looking, but they certainly weren't all losers. They were often people who were emotionally vulnerable because of their family circumstances or their education.
And what explanation do you have for the fact that they kept coming back? I mean, while they were at Winchester College, you can see that that was part of it. But they went away to universities. They were grown young men living away from school, living away from their families. And yet they would get on the train to go to Winchester to be beaten, and they wouldn't talk to anybody about it. How do you explain that?
It only makes sense to me if you understand the Iwerne movement as a cult. Of course, people who were in the movement and people who are in the movement today and have been corresponding with me vigorously over the last few weeks don't want to recognize Iwerne as a cult, because if you're a member of a cult, you don't think you're a member of a cult. You think you've discovered the one true path. The things that cults do are kind of neatly summarized for me. There's a conversion, which is total, a total commitment, nothing held back. Then there's a process of conditioning, shaping people, telling them that this is the only way, educating them in it, giving them a set of codes, language codes, dress codes, and so on, which is very, very strong in the Iwerne movement, so that conditions people into it. And then there's a level of coercion as well. By the time you're that deeply in, you can't possibly see yourself dropping out. And people in that movement still find that very difficult. If I admit that there's a flaw somewhere in this thing, I'm going to lose everything. And that everything may be my job, if I'm a vicar, my house, but primarily my identity. My whole identity has been wrapped up in committing myself wholly to this. I can't cope with the prospect of life outside. I can't cope with the prospect of shame at having been in some way wrong. So one of the distinctives of people who are attracted to this movement is there is no room for discussion. There's no room for nuance or variation or learning or anything like that. You are either wholly in this movement with all of its values and quirks and codes, or you are wholly out.
Okay. How many of those who left retained any sort of Christian faith?
Quite a lot. Quite a lot of Smythe's victims are still active in the church, and several of them haven't yet identified themselves, or have taken a long time to identify themselves as victims.
But sorry, those are, you would say, members of the cult still. I'm interested in the ones who actually left.
Yeah. Obviously, numbers of people left and have gone on to pursue other things, but many of them, as with many victims of abuse, still live with the emotional and psychological consequences of it and deal with it in various ways.
Okay, one last question, if I may. How many of the trustees of the Iwerne Trust over the years have been convicted of safeguarding offences or charged with them or come to related sad ends?
Prior to the last 2 or 3 years, very few. The Iwerne movement has attracted a disproportionate number of people who have been convicted of safeguarding offences. I think I can think of probably at least 7 leaders of that movement who have unambiguously been involved in safeguarding offences and have either been convicted or there is no further doubt about it. One of the interesting phenomena that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is that numbers of the leaders of those movements have found themselves in trouble one way or another with the church. So one of the things that I think has passed without very much notice so far is that the man who was chair of the trust, of the Titus Trust at the time when these offences were brought to light in 2017, the man who dealt with the offences on behalf of the Titus Trust is a man called Ian Broomfield. Ian Broomfield is a vicar he was chair of the trust at the time. He was also a vicar in Bromley, and for the last 12 months he too has been suspended. And amongst the things that are being investigated there are recent and historic safeguarding allegations.
Right. Okay, we probably shouldn't say too much more about those, but we've got a question here from Ruth Peacock, which is, how do you account for the fact that some prominent evangelicals have been associated with abuse of this kind? And is there any evidence of soul searching to identify the faults in the theology that lends itself to this sort of behaviour?
What I find in the church is that when this sort of behaviour or abusive behaviour comes up, there is a kind of soul searching amongst leaders of the church, and the questions they ask are, what could it possibly be other than our beliefs and practices that could cause this to happen? It surely can't be to do with our beliefs and practices, because our beliefs are correct, and our practices, although they might be improperly followed, if only they were, if only we fulfilled all the things that we're supposed to do, these problems wouldn't happen. There is a real reluctance to look at culture and theology and beliefs as a potential cause.
Maureen Mulvey wanted to ask about how Smythe's victims are coping today and what their lives are like. I mean, you said a little bit about that, but I wonder if you could say a bit more, and I wonder if you could say something about how they are responding to the work that you're doing and indeed this book, and whether they're all comfortable with it having been written, and what your experience of walking alongside them has been.
All victims of abuse are different, and I couldn't possibly speak for all of them. And I don't personally know all of them, but I do know quite a large number, and quite a large number of Smythe's victims have read the book before publication and encouraged me very much in getting it out. As to how they're coping today, all victims of abuse deal with it in different ways. Some like to put their experience in a box and sit on top of the box and never look at it again. Some can't get through an hour without being disturbed by what happened to them. Yeah, all victims are different, and they're different in what they want. Some want to be able to get on with their lives and never think about it again. Some desperately want information. What happened? How was it allowed to happen? Some want to see perpetrators or bystanders being brought to some kind of justice. Some want or need levels of financial redress or compensation. People want different things. Victims of abuse also cope differently, and I don't think you can. I don't think you can measure the severity of abuse in relation to what was done. You can only measure it in relation to how people have been affected by it. There are people who were beaten by Smythe once or twice who have been traumatized for life, and there were others who were beaten by Smythe continually over a period of 4 or 5 years, who in many ways have got on with their lives. I don't think you can measure abuse from that end, as it were.
And are there others who might say that actually the way in which their complaints or experiences have been handled since are almost a form of secondary abuse? There's bad as the abuse that happened. Without
a doubt. The most common complaint of victims of church abuse of various sorts is that the way that the church or the institutions, in this case the Titus Trust or Winchester College or whoever, have treated them is a form of re-abuse. And some will say, oh, that's as bad as the initial abuse. And I always say, you sure, do you really mean that? But some do, actually. So Of course, abuse happens in all sorts of spheres. It happens in sport, it happens in schools, it happens in all sorts of places. But one would wish and hope that abuse that happens in and around the church will get a different kind of response. There is still a shocking degree of resistance from the church to dealing with this, and specifically to dealing with what happened around John Smythe.
We've got a question here from Andrew Carey, Andrew, which is, everyone on this call is called Andrew today. Is how important do you think the role and culture of the sort of public schools and the culture of corporal punishment is to Smythe in this specific case?
It does have an importance. There were a lot of people early on who were saying, well, this is just the culture of public schools and you all need to toughen up a bit, and yeah, people get thrashed and whatever it is. By no means everyone, and it has to be borne in mind that when Mark Ruston made his report in 1982, he already identified that what happened was illegal. So in answer to Andrew's question, yes, I do think the culture of corporal punishment is part of it, but there's so much else to the culture of independent schools, and particularly boarding schools. Privilege, exclusivity, race, the kind of closed culture that says loyalty to institution first, and loyalty to institution above everything, really, above truth or whatever. So corporal punishment is a part of that, and it's in a sense it's part of the conditioning and the reinforcement. To move that over to the church, I think that that some of the roots of this are in particular perceptions of the body, of the human body. There was certainly a strong slant in Iwerne theology that said that the body was something that was prone to let you down and needed to be dominated and thrashed into submission, cold showers, sports, beatings, whatever it took. A kind of a loathing of the human body. So if I beat your body until you have submission over it, I've done you a favour.
Tim Wyatt, Tim, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Andrew, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts were on how kind of changing the culture within kind of conservative evangelical Anglicanism, which, as you'll know, is kind of really starting to shift as a result of kind of the Smythe and the related kind of Jonathan Fletcher abuse scandals. I just wonder whether you feel like, is there a risk in using language like calling Iwerne and related things cultish, that you kind of sabotage that growing interest among some conservative evangelicals to look more seriously at their own culture? Any thoughts on how you kind of tread that balance between trying to get buy-in from some of these people while not kind of making them feel their own culture, theology, practices under threat?
Well, I refer you back to the previous answer, which was churches saying, well, we're determined to get on top of this and to work out what's going on, as long as it doesn't change any of our beliefs or our practices. You simply, that can't be done. A core one within the Church of England is the culture of deference to leaders. And there's a lot of talk in the House of Bishops, for instance, about how deference causes us terrible problems, we must get away with this, said one Lord Bishop to the other. There isn't a small tweak that can be made to evangelical or Anglican culture that will deal with this. Beyond that, it's not my job really to change that or to get buy-in from people or anything like that. My job is just to try and explain what happened and help to think about why.
come to some of the handling of the issue by some of the organisations involved. I mean, the Titus Trust issued a timeline last week laying out when it knew about things, how it responded. In its statement, it says, "We readily acknowledge that we've made mistakes, but there's not been, as some have suggested, any cover-up on our part." How do you respond to that statement?
It depends who the "we" is who's making that statement. One of the extraordinary things about that timeline that the Titus Trust published, well, aside from the fact that they chose to publish it a week before the book came out rather than 5 years ago, one of the extraordinary things that emerges from that is just how long everything took, from the point in 2012 where they were first alerted to this. There's a huge long gap during which they 3 people in the Titus Trust try to manage it themselves. It's 18 months before they informed their own trustees. We then discover that the chair of the Titus Trust has an envelope in his loft that was given to him by the previous chair with a message saying, "This is about John Smythe, don't open it until you need to." And I want to say to anybody who leads a charity or a church or a whatever organisation, if somebody gives you a sealed envelope and says, "Don't open it until you need to," open it now. How could they wait such a long time before they even told their own trustees? And then there's a further gap of nearly a year before they start to take any kind of action. It's extraordinary, really. Now, the current Titus trustees are almost completely changed over from the bunch who were in charge about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, when all this happened. So I don't know. We may be seeing a new group of Titus trustees. If that's the case, then I would simply want to ask whether I want to ask whether that kind of model of elitism has any place in the church anyway. Still today, if you want to send your kids on a Titus Trust camp, you will need to be invited. And if you just write and say, "I'd like to send my kids on a camp," they will ask you what school they go to and what house they're in. And if they're not in the right house or the right school, you'll get a polite letter back saying you might be better off at a different camp.
Right. Another person who feels that you may not have represented him correctly is Justin Welby. You say in your acknowledgements at the beginning of the book that he's read it and that he found it painful, and that he was offered the opportunity to write a response for inclusion, but declined. I mean, where does, briefly, if you can, your account of what happens and his version, where are there points of tension there?
Justin Welby's a good man in an impossible job. He tends to say what he wants to be true rather than what is. When he was interviewed in 2019 by Cathy Newman, he said, amongst many other things, John Smythe wasn't an Anglican. Well, he was an Anglican lay reader in England and in South Africa. He attended Anglican churches and some other churches. He was, when I mentioned that to the Bishop of Bath and Wells, he said, "John Smythe's more Anglican than me." I think there's something about Justin Welby not wanting that to be true. If the question is, did Justin Welby do everything that he was required to do by law and practice, the answer may be yes. If the question is, could he or should he have done more, did he? The answer is certainly yes. He says that he wasn't required or able to do anything as Archbishop in 2013 when he was told, because the disclosure had been made to another bishop. But that ignores the fact that this was his tribe that it had happened in.
Well, that's one of the things that he would take issue with, wasn't it? That he was embedded in that culture.
Yes, I think he doesn't like to believe that. There's no doubt that he was embedded in Iwerne culture in the early days. He was, he went to Iwerne camps. He was a junior leader. A junior officer, as they were called. He was a speaker on Iwerne camps. I know that he diverged from that to an extent, but he went to way back at the beginning when this first came out in 2017. He said, after I went to Paris, I had nothing to do with them. Actually, he went back to a Iwerne camp in 1989 and again in 1991. So it simply wasn't accurate to say that he had nothing to do with them. He was associated with this tribe for 13 or 14 years, associated enough to go to the camps. Now, I know he would, if you asked him how would he identify himself, he would no more say, well, I'm a Iwerne man, than he would say, I'm a whatever, anything else. But there is no doubt that he has a special affinity with this tribe that you might think gives him a greater responsibility.
Well, he, or rather the Church of England, has now set up an independent review, the Macon review.
Yeah.
I think Julia Cameron's asking, why did you want to publish this book now rather than wait for the outcome of that review?
Well, we're doing a different job. The job of the Macon review is to work out whether the Church of England did what it was supposed to do by its own lights. That my job is to document the story of John Smythe and to try and ask some questions as to how and why this happened. So there's two separate jobs to be done there. There are large tracts of the story that the Macon Review won't touch, like Smythe's entire career in South Africa. We're doing a different job. Also, we'd have to ask, the Macon Review has been quite interesting in itself. The review was promised on the day after John Smythe died. The Church of England announced it was going to have a review. It took another 12 months to commission the review after that, and then another 4 months to start it. It then said that it was going to have the review complete by May of 2020. And now we're told that it'll be ready sometime, well, there's no defined time at the moment, but sometime in the middle of 2022. So I think if we waited for the Macon Review, we might wait forever.
Do you have any confidence in it?
I've no way of, if I judged it by the impact that previous Church of England reviews have had, the answer would have to be no. Quite often, Church of England reviews get a decent person who does a decent job, and then they sit on a shelf and absolutely nothing happens. So I've no criticism of Keith Macon because we haven't seen what he's done yet. But in terms of my hope for whether it'll make a difference, no, not really.
Two more questions before we go. We might just go by a couple of minutes if people are happy with that. Francis Ween, can I come to you?
Yes, I was wondering if you'd had any contact with the family, the Smythe family, and how they, especially the wife, but also the children, explained away for all these years what their father was up to as more and more came up. It must be quite apparent that something was going on in that garden shed. Was it that the wife, Anne in particular, shared his rather violent bleeding for Jesus theology, or that she was turning a blind eye? Or do you have any sense of that from your research?
Yes, and thank you. I have quite a bit of contact with John Smythe's children. I haven't had direct contact with Anne Smythe, his wife. She did know what was going on from a very early stage. That's clear. I regard the Smythe family as John Smythe's first victims. PJ Smythe, his oldest son, as the book will say, was a victim of John Smythe in every sense. He was treated physically in the same way that the other victims were treated, but earlier, from the age of 8 onwards. He, as a teenager, above all, thought that this was the way things were meant to be, that the way his father was treating him was the way that good fathers treated their children. John Smythe treated his children appallingly. There is much more detail in the book, but there's also quite a lot more that I haven't put in the book because it's theirs, not mine. But the Smythe children have read the book. In the American church, PJ is suffering a degree of persecution because some campaigners in the American church have said that he ought to have done more earlier, or that perhaps he covered up for his father. I think if you understand the situation that he was in and the degree of grooming that he suffered, you would have nothing but sympathy for him in that. They were appallingly treated in ways, some of which I will not go into.
There's a question from Anna Drew. She's had to leave the meeting, but we'll ask the question and she can catch up with the answer later. She says she's been interested to know what the impact of this work has been on you personally.
Well, I don't carry this particular scar, so it doesn't wound me in the way that it wounds others who were victims. Perhaps that allows some other things for me. Perhaps it allows me to be more angry and less shameful, to be more angry about hypocrisy. Can
you tell me 2 moments when this story made you the most angry?
Yes. When Justin Welby was being interviewed by Kathy Newman, I'm not saying that he was lying. He may have been badly briefed, or he may have been saying things that he hoped were true. But I was absolutely seething when he did that, because that was a completely inappropriate response. I was pretty angry when I eventually got invited to Lambeth Palace to tell them what happened, and all they wanted was to know how much I knew, how much trouble they were in, rather than wanting to know what they could do for the victims and survivors.
What would you like to see now for the victims and survivors?
You'd have to ask them what they want. They want honesty from the church and from the Titus Trust. They want apologies, not on behalf of John Smythe, who's thankfully dead, but on behalf of those who have covered up or failed to deal with this. From the wider Christian community, I would just like to see a whole lot more really honest soul searching about ways in which the Christian institutions do damage while they're trying to do good, ways in which the light that they want to shed actually casts shadows, and in those shadows terrible things can happen. That's a hard but really honest conversation. And if that conversation isn't had, I think the Christian community will just continue to dwindle.
Thank you. We've gone a few minutes over. Andrew, thank you so much for taking your time with us today. Bleeding for Jesus is available from all good booksellers from Thursday.
Some bad ones.
Say?
And some bad ones.
Oh, and some bad ones as well. And if you manage to leave the book for more than twice to get yourself a cup of tea, I'll be surprised. I read it twice in one sitting, both times. Thank you very much. RMC will be back with another briefing soon. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.